Hi folks, Jeff here. Today we're going to be talking about Palo Alto Network's high availability configuration. In our agenda today, there's a few pieces that we're going to cover. Specifically, what is high availability for Palo Alto Networks? How does it work? What does it mean? We'll talk about active-passive versus active-active HA or high availability. We'll talk about those high availability interfaces. Within Palo Alto Networks, there are certain interfaces and certain optics, certain configurations that we need to use specifically for that high availability function. And so we'll talk about what those interfaces are and how to configure those. Finally, I'll do a basic demo of our high availability configuration along with some troubleshooting. So the configuration that we'll do today is just basic configuration, how to put together simple high availability so you can get this to work. And then we'll talk about a few of those issues that you may run into, and I'll talk about how to troubleshoot that and how to fix those simple things. Again, we're not going to deep dive too much into high availability today, just enough to where you understand the concepts and can do the basic configuration and that basic troubleshooting. So what is high availability? The way Palo Alto Networks defines high availability, it's that connection or that ability to fail over from within two next generation firewalls, be they physical or virtual. So you need to understand that the physical and virtual firewalls within Palo Alto Networks are both capable of doing high availability and doing that failover of sessions of traffic from one firewall to another firewall. Now, the primary use case for high availability is hardware redundancy. And it's hardware redundancy for two identical firewalls. And so this is normally why we don't see this too much within our virtual firewalls, particularly within public cloud, and that most enterprises will choose to do horizontal scaling rather than do traditional high availability within public cloud, specifically because it gives them that ability to go past two firewalls and can go to 3, 4, 5, a dozen firewalls and put them behind a load balancer rather than being limited to just two. We see this much more within the physical firewalls. And within those firewalls, we have a few prerequisites in order to do high availability. Prerequisite number one is that they be the same firewall model, whether that be the 200 series, the 220s, the 800 series, the 5200 series, or the 7000s. Really what we want is the same firewall model. So if we're using an 820 for our primary, we're going to use an 820 for our secondary or our passive firewall as well. And the primary reason for that is this last prerequisite, that interface and interface types have to match between both our active and our passive or active and active firewalls within high availability. Now, the other prerequisites for high availability include having the same PAN-OS version, and that has to be the same major and minor version. That's primarily because if we have any new features or capabilities, we want those shared between our primary and our secondary firewalls or our active and passive firewalls. And then finally, we need the same license. So many of the people that I talk with or the businesses we work with, they ask the question of, do I need to have a threat prevention license, a URL filtering license, a wildfire license, DNS security license on my passive, that backup firewall, even though I'm not using it, 99% of the time? And the answer is yes. And this is primarily because when we do that failover, there isn't a way to fail over the licensing from the primary firewall to the backup firewall or from that active to the passive firewall. And so those licenses need to be there and need to be ready. And that way we have the configuration is already moved over to our passive firewall. It's already stored there. And those sessions can automatically move over and we can continue with that high availability within seconds. Now, let's talk about the two different modes of high availability. The first, and this is the one that most enterprises choose to go with, is the active-passive mode. And in that situation, the active firewall or the primary firewall handles all of the traffic and the sessions. That secondary or the passive firewall doesn't process any of the traffic. And in most cases, the interfaces on that secondary firewall, that passive firewall, will be down. The other mode for high availability, and it's gotten more popular, has been active-active. We see this quite often in data center environments, primarily in situations where enterprises want to be able to utilize both firewalls, want both firewalls processing traffic, and really want to shorten that failover time should something happen to one of the firewalls. In that situation, both the primary and the secondary firewall process all of the traffic and the sessions, and the primary firewall will normally handle that session setup and assignment of who gets that session. Now, there's a few different ways to determine who's going to do session setup and the session ownership within that communication. We won't dive into that too much today. I'll try to do another video where we dive into that a little bit more, because there's several modes that we can use to determine who's going to own that session, who's going to do the setup and the ownership there. So the next piece we need to talk about is high availability interfaces. In order to do HA between two of our firewalls, we need to set up interfaces so that the two firewalls can talk to each other and understand which one is the primary firewall, which one is the secondary firewall, which one's going to be active or passive. And the way we do that is through these interfaces. And this is just an overview right now, but I'll get into what each one of these does in the next few slides. First one is HA1. That's our control link. That's going to be doing our heartbeats between our two devices, our two firewalls. HA2 is specifically our session synchronization link. Now, HA1 and HA2 are primarily used for active-passive. And when we move over into active-active is where we start using HA3, which is our packet forwarding link. And that's sending sessions and actual traffic from our active to what would be the other active firewall. Now, for each of these interfaces, because they're so important, primarily HA1 and HA2, we have backups for those. So that will be our HA1 backup and our HA2 backup. And then we've also got a heartbeat backup. Now, the HA1 link does our heartbeat between our two firewalls. And then the heartbeat backup is a way to make sure that we will continue to see that heartbeat go between the two firewalls should something happen to the HA1 link. This is where we want to avoid what's known as a split brain scenario. And I'll get a little more into that in just a moment. So let's talk a little bit in more detail about the HA1 link. HA1 is our control link, and it's one of the most important connections that we can have as far as high availability goes. Across this link, we're going to exchange hellos, and that's for setting up high availability. Heartbeats, which is keeping that high availability synchronized between the two, saying, from the active to the passive, hey, are you there? And back and forth. And then also maintaining HA state information. Who's in charge, who's the primary, or who's the active and who's the passive. We're also going to exchange other pieces of our configuration, like the dynamic routing. All of our user ID information is going to go across this link. So if we're doing user ID within our security policies, that information that we're pulling down for the user ID will push over. Same thing for our configuration syncs. Every time we do a configuration change on our primary firewall or active firewall, we're going to push that over to the passive firewall. Now, the HA1 link is a layer 3 link. It has an IP address that's required on both sides of that link. By default, it's going to be doing TCP port 28769 and 28260 in clear text. You can also go encrypted, where you'll do SSH over TCP. HA2 is our session sync link, and that's going to be all of our forwarding tables, our IPsec security associations, our ARP tables, and all of this primarily is going to be in a unidirectional flow, going from our primary firewall to the secondary firewall. The only exception for that is what's known as the HA2 keep alive, which is this HA2 link up and can we communicate across it? And so you'll occasionally see keep alives coming from our secondary firewall going back to the primary firewall. Now, the big difference between the HA1 link and the HA2 link is that we don't necessarily have to go layer 3 for HA2. By default, we'll see that this is set up for layer 2 with its own ether type. And if we don't want to do that, we can also go to IP protocol number 99 or UDP port 29281 in case we need to span subnets. Now, a reminder on HA1, that was a layer 3 link, so we can go across a route interface or a layer 3 interface to make those connections. We don't necessarily have to be directly connected. My preference is that we directly connect those links between the two firewalls, but there are situations where the primary firewall and the secondary firewall aren't close to each other, and so we have to do longer runs or go through a routed environment or a layer 3 environment. Now, HA3, as I mentioned before, this is required for active-active. So if we're doing both firewalls are processing traffic, doing session setup or session ownership, and traffic is running through both of the firewalls at the same time, then we need to have an HA3 link. This is specifically for packet forwarding. This is going to send production traffic across that link in the scenario where we've got production traffic where, let's say, the primary firewall is the owner of that session, but we see the traffic come in through the secondary firewall. This is our way for that secondary firewall to send the traffic back to the primary so that we can have synchronous sessions, and that session can be maintained on the primary firewall. This connection is a layer 2 link that uses MAC in MAC encapsulation. It does not support layer 3 addressing or encryption. So if you're going to do active-active, again, the recommendation is to make these close enough, but you don't have an option to go through a layer 3 network to make this work. So let's talk a little bit about our backup interfaces. As I just said, the HA1 and the HA2 links are vital in both active-passive and active-active, right? They're going to be doing those hellos, the heartbeats, the session synchronization, the config syncs, all of those pieces, the routing updates, user ID, all of those are going across the HA1 and then the HA2 links. So it makes sense to have a backup for these whenever possible. Now, there's a few rules for the HA1 and HA2 links. In many situations, there will not be dedicated links or dedicated ports for these backup links. Normally with our HA1 and HA2 links, on most of the firewalls, there's going to be dedicated ports specifically for that operate on the management plane. For our backups, we're typically going to have to use one of our data interfaces as a backup. And so we're going to have to burn one of those ports on the data side in order to make these backup links. But depending on your level of risk aversion or how much risk you want to avoid, it makes sense to create backups for the HA1 and the HA2 links. Now, in the situation of having an HA1 backup that is a data port, the other recommendation is to do a heartbeat backup. Heartbeat backup is just a checkbox that we can check, and I'll show you this in our demo. It's going to communicate over port 28771 on the management interface automatically. And if you remember, on Palo Alto Networks firewalls, there is a dedicated management port. And so what this will do is between those two management interfaces, we'll exchange a backup heartbeat. So should the HA1 links go down and the backups, we still have a heartbeat. So we can avoid what's known as a split brain scenario. Split brain means that we've lost communication between our primary and our secondary firewall. And because of that, both firewalls go active. Both are responding and accepting traffic. Both are using the same IP addresses and are trying to interact with our network. And what you're going to wind up with is, at best, asynchronous traffic. At worst, you're going to be black holing traffic within your environment. So doing an HA1 backup and certainly a heartbeat backup are definitely recommended within the environment. I want to circle back here on our backup links for HA1 and HA2. We have a few rules for this. Specifically, the IP addresses of the primary and backup HA links must not overlap each other, and they have to be in different subnets from the primary HA links. They also, for the backups, have to be configured on separate physical ports. And in the demo, I'll show you how we can create those HA ports and really what I use for IP addressing. My preference is to use a /30 subnet, where I've basically got 2 IP addresses, one on each side of that connection, and that makes my life much easier. That way I'm not overlapping with another network, and we don't have those issues. So let's talk a little bit. I've got a look here at a 5220, and then after this I'm going to show you an 820, and you'll see that between our different hardware models, there's going to be different HA setups, and that you need to be aware of those, and it can be a little bit confusing. So we'll talk about these a little bit more, but I've also put together a matrix of what the HA ports are for each of our hardware models, and then what ports you can use, whether they be built-in dedicated ports, whether you have to burn a data port, and what your options are there. So let's take a look at a 5220, and specifically there's 2 HA ports that are dedicated, and then what's known as an HSCI. So let's talk a little bit about this. It's not a great picture here, but this is an HA1A and an HA1B port on this 5220. What that means is that we've got the HA1 primary port, and then the HA1 backup are both dedicated links on this one. All right, so we don't have to burn a data port to get an HA1 backup. And then in this situation, we have this HSCI port, which is a high-speed chassis interconnect. What this does is it takes the function of both the HA2, and in the case of active-active, will also transmit the HA3 traffic across this HSCI port. Now this is a QSFP either 28 or QSFP plus or QSFP 28, depending on which model of 5200s. But it gives us the ability to do all of that HA configuration as well as have a backup. And these are all dedicated ports that are on the management plane and not used by the data plane. But we can certainly burn other ports on the data plane if we need to, specifically say for an HA2 backup or that sort of thing. Now in the case of something like the 800 series, the HA configuration changes there as well. And like I said, with each model that we have, what's available for dedicated HA ports and what you can use for your HA configuration changes. So that's why I've created this matrix. I will link it to this video within the description on the video so that you can have some idea of what the HA configuration is and how you can set this up. So to give you an example, on the 820s, we've got our dedicated management port. Remember, when we do our heartbeat backups, it's across this management port. And then we've got our 2 HA ports, so HA1 and HA2. And you'll see, unlike the 5200 series, we don't have an option for HA3. So in this situation, if you wanted to go to active-active, you would have to burn one or more, usually port channel, if you want to get redundancy, for that HA3 link, so you can get the active-active capability there. So now that I've explained all that, what we're going to do next is jump into the demo. I'm going to show you some basic high availability configuration, and then a little bit on the troubleshooting, and then I'll show you how we can fix that. Again, take a look at the link for the high availability matrix below, and you'll be able to understand how this all fits together. Now we're going to be taking a look at our demo, and I'll show you how we're going to do our basic HA configuration. You see here that I've got 2 interfaces up, logged into 2 different firewalls. Both of these are going to be 820 series firewalls. I've got my primary one, which I've called Alpha, and my secondary one, which we're calling Bravo. Now, when we set this up and you're doing your HA configuration, most of your configuration is going to be in the Device tab, and specifically clicking on this link in the left for high availability. And for this video, we're just going to focus on this general tab. There's a couple other pieces with link path and monitoring and some of the operational commands. I'll try to cover those in a second video. We're just going to get into the basics today so you can get this running, and then I'll show you some troubleshooting as well. So let's dive right into it, and we can talk about what the different pieces here are. So first of all, you're going to do the setup, and when you do this, first you're going to, anytime you make any of these changes, you're going to click on that gear icon. We're going to click on the one for setup. You're going to enable HA, which means we're enabling high availability. We're going to create a group number. This group number needs to be anywhere from 0 to 63. If you try to go outside that number, it will yell at you. So you need to put it somewhere between 0 and 63. I just picked 33. Make sure that on your primary and secondary firewall, these match up. We're going to set our mode. In this case, we're going to call active passive, and in a minute I'll show you the active and what that opens up for us. And then we're going to set to enable config sync. Remember that we can do configuration synchronization from our primary to our secondary firewalls, so we want to go ahead and enable that. And then we're going to set our peer address. In this case, I'm going to go with 172.16.1.2. And you'll see in just a moment that I'm going to have 1.1 as my HA1. So like I said, I like to use /30 addresses so that I can just have two addresses, one on the primary firewall, one on the secondary firewall. Makes my life much easier, and so that we're not overlapping within our networks. So let's go from that, and this is what we're configuring just for the basic setup. And here I set the peer HA1 IP address. Let's talk about what we set for our IP address. In this case, because I'm on an 820, for my HA1 link, there's a dedicated HA1 link. We could do management if we wanted to, or I could do one of my dataplane ports. And you'll see that I have one of those available, and I'll show you why that's available to me in just a moment. But in this case, I'm going to use my dedicated HA1, and we're going to set an IP address because this is a layer 3 interface, and I have to have an IP address on it. So I'm going to go with 172.16.1.1 and make it a /30 subnet. The other piece I'm going to then do is set up my HA2 link. So for HA2, we're going to use, in this case, the dedicated HA2 link. And we're going to enable session synchronization. What that means is that we're going to send that session information from our primary firewall, our active firewall, over to our passive firewall. And you'll see here that I don't have an IP address configured, and that's because by default, this is going to be an Ethernet transport or a layer 2 transport. If I want to, I can switch this over to IP, and that's protocol 99, or we can go over to UDP and go on that port. And then I'm also going to select whether or not to do that HA2 keep alive. Remember I said that going from the primary to the secondary firewall, that's normally a unidirectional path, but not if we do an HA2 keep alive. This is just to say from the passive back to the active and vice versa. We're going to do that keep alive and say, are you there? Is this path still up? And then if that is to fail, we want to understand what our options are. And there's the option of log only, or split data path. Split data path is only used for active-active scenarios, and it's telling those active-active firewalls to continue maintaining their sessions should they lose connectivity. But since we're doing active-passive, we just need to log only. And then we're doing a threshold. I'm just going to leave those to the defaults for the threshold of when we do those communications. Finally, what I'm going to look at on this page is our election settings. Now, deciding which firewall is going to become the active or the passive is based here in our election settings. And that's all based on our device priority. By default, the devices will have a priority of 100. That's the default, and we can set a priority anywhere from 0 to 255. If you go outside this number, it will yell at you, and you're going to have to set it for something within that range. The lower the number, the better the priority. So the lower number in our device priority is what's going to win in this election and become the active firewall. My recommendation to you within an enterprise is to just go ahead and set a standard for this. Whether that's, in my case, I'm going to do on my primary, I'm going to set device priority for 100, and on my secondary, I'm going to set that for 110. Or you do something like 90 and 100, but make sure you set a standard around your organization so that it's not confusing when you're logging into your primary and your secondary firewalls. The next thing is preemptive, and that's to say, if the primary firewall goes away, needs to reboot, something happens, and then it comes back, preemptive is saying, I want this firewall to take back over as the primary firewall, as the active firewall, and start processing traffic again. And then finally, heartbeat backup. Heartbeat, like we said, is that connection between the management interfaces. This is simply a checkbox. If you check the box, there will be a heartbeat backup between the two management interfaces. Finally is our HA timer settings. We're just going to go with the recommended settings today. I'll try to do a follow-up video where we talk about the aggressive and the advanced settings where you can really dial this in. But for most organizations, for most enterprises, recommended is going to be just fine. Now, this is also where you can set those HA1 backups and the HA2 backups. Remember, on the 820s, we don't have an HA1 backup or an HA2 backup as a dedicated port. If we want to set either one of those, we'll have to go with going with like our Ethernet 1.5 and make that happen, or create another data port to make that happen for us. And in those cases, what we're going to have to do is create an IP address and a net mask for those. Same thing on our HA2 backup. Now, what you might notice is there's no configuration here for HA3. And the reason there's no configuration here for HA3 is because we've selected active passive. Now, if I were to change this over to active, what you're going to see is that, and select yes here, what you're going to see is that we should add another tab here. And this other tab that showed up is for active configuration. And with the active configuration, you'll have the option then to set that HA3 interface and decide which interface that's going to be for this set of firewalls. Okay, if you just have active passive, you're not going to see this tab or any of the HA3 configuration. So let's go and revert those changes, and we'll go back to our active passive. Okay. Now, once these are all in place, you're going to do the same thing on your secondary firewall. And in this situation, I'm going to say this is active passive. The big difference here is we're going to have our IP addresses are going to be flipped from what we had on our primary for our HA1 link. And remember, our device priority is going to be set for a little bit higher, like 110, than our active firewall. The other thing we want to do here is, if you're doing preemptive on one, you need to go and do, it is recommended by Palo Alto Networks to do preemptive on both. So we'll set those as well. Okay. Now, once this is all set up, the question is, where do we see our status on this and understand what the status is for our high availability? And let me show you where that's going to be. That's going to be right over here on our dashboard, and we're going to look at our widgets. By default, this high availability widget is not visible. It's not one of the widgets that shows up automatically. So what you may have to do is go here to the widgets drop down, go to system, and then select high availability. Now I've got mine set up here, so we should be good to go. Now what you can do, if we look here on our active one, and I'll do my configuration from there, or any of my changes, when we first set this up, you may get some issues here, right? Now, what you want to see here is that we're good in a number of areas, like the HA1 port, HA2 port, and the heartbeat backup ports are there. that our PanOS version matches up, and so we're all good there. But we've still got some red lights here, so we do need to fix these. By default, what's going to happen is when you first connect to HA, you may have to do this sync to peer, where you're going from your primary or your active firewall and pushing configuration to your secondary firewall, to the passive firewall. Because what's going to need to get pushed, or we're going to need to synchronize that configuration so that should we have a failover from our active to our passive, there is no difference in configuration. So you'll click on this link to synchronize to the peer, and we should be good to go there. The other thing you may notice is an app or a threat version mismatch. Now the interesting thing here is that if you fix one of these red lights, you're going to fix them both. The reason we have two different red lights is because app and threat used to be two different dynamic updates. They're now in one package, and so you'll see here it will tell you if you arrow over exactly what the issue is that our app version doesn't match, but also if I arrow over the other one, you'll see the message that I get is exactly the same. So what I need to do is fix the same thing to fix both of those lights. So I'll synchronize my peer, and then I'll need to fix this, and the way we do that is going to be in device, and it's going to be in our dynamic updates. And specifically what we're going to have to do is within our apps and threats, if you've looked at any of your dynamic updates, apps and threats is what was giving us the red lights within our configuration or within our HA. The way we fix that is we look at our schedule. And along with our schedule, and this is a good idea for all enterprises, is to have a schedule for your dynamic updates so they will automatically download and install on your firewalls. But the other piece you want to do is click on this checkbox right here to sync to peer, click OK, and then commit. And then the next time this downloads and installs, it will also push that configuration over to your firewall itself. Now, the other thing you can do is manually do this. So if you download and do an install, you'll also have the option to synchronize to the peer at that same time. So all of these things will fix those red lights, and then all of these should green up and you'll be good to go. Now, that quickly went through our HA configuration and how to do the basics. I hope this helped you. Thanks for watching. If you have any comments or questions, please post them below. And as always, stay secure.